One of the main qualities of podcasting is that you can experiment with your hosting style and match that to your personality. But the reality is that so many podcasters feel like they have to be a journalist or a radio broadcaster on their show. And that removes a lot of the character that the podcast could have. So this episode is all about breaking down different types of hosting styles that you can use on your show to find your groove and to create a product that resonates not only with you, but with podcast listeners. I'm Anna Xavier, and this is the Podcast Space, a podcast that will help elevate your podcast journey one imperfect episode at a time. Let's dive in. As you start a podcast, or as you launch a podcast to launch your own personal brand, or as you launch a podcast to expand the reach of your current brand, there's a lot to think about. One of the things that isn't discussed often in podcasting is that when you start a podcast, you have to learn like 7 different types of skills. One of them, speaking. And there is a difference between speaking to the microphone without a camera and having to speak directly to a camera. I've mentioned on the podcast before, and if you're new here, I used to be a journalist, I used to do radio, I've co-hosted so many different podcasts that I lost count. And also English is not my first language, so there's a lot of that too. But the reality is that when I launched my own podcast as a thought leader in the podcast industry, I really experienced a personal kind of doubt on, the host that I was going to be. And the cool thing about podcasting is that really it doesn't matter what type of angle you're giving these podcasts. Like there will be always people willing to listen. There's so many niches for everything. And the reality is that when you're a professional and you're trying to find your voice as a podcast host, there's just so many different routes you can take. You can take the professional route. You can take a more authentic route. Like that to me was the route that I wanted to take. And I remember really struggling in the beginning of my podcast journey because when I was thinking about the show, obviously I had honed the content strategy. In terms of technology, I knew what I was going to use. I was going to pick something that wasn't going to be incredibly complicated. But the reality is that starting a podcast is also a self-development journey. And figuring out who you are sometimes through the podcast is figuring out also who you are as an expert when you're talking to nobody at the same time, right? Because I am talking to you directly, the listener, but there's no feedback in real time, right? I'm not doing these show live, so I don't see people's reactions. I don't know if you're understanding. When I misspeak, especially, I accidentally misspeak a lot. And I realized that there was a lot about my approach to podcasting that changed since I've launched the show. And so helping you understand what is a strategy that you can use for your show and tell you about the options really simplifies the journey, because so often people feel like they have to embody the Mr. Know-It-All, and there's value in experimenting, but also being upfront about that style of hosting. So that makes a perfect segue into the 2 types of hosting style that most people will have to determine when they start a podcast, or when they launch a podcast, or when they realize that podcast is not working and they have to change. Basically, we're starting at the lens of the expert or the learner. Now, for most people who are using the podcast as a business tool, you will use the lens of the expert. And even within that lens of the expert, there's 2 ones that you can do. One of these things that caught me by surprise by hosting the Podcast Space as a weekly podcast was that I had the realization that I really have a lot to say about podcasting, and it actually bolstered my confidence. And while of course every single week I'm talking about things that I already know, I also do a little bit of extra research. So every single week, I'm learning a little bit more on this topic that I'm teaching you. But at the same time, I'm also perfecting this to go on speaking engagements. And I'm going to be writing a book this year. So definitely that's going to help me iron out the ideas. But there's also the expert kind of learner that you can take. So basically is when you're inviting other people on the show. And I've done that before where, hey, I know a little bit about SEO. I know a little bit about branding. I know a little bit about how to monetize a podcast. But these people that I'm inviting on the show, they're experts. So basically having these conversations cements my knowledge, but also sometimes when I have a little bit of expertise on the area, It helps also the listener understand that I have a little bit of knowledge. So I'm continuing to be the expert. And I feel like those are conversations that are really interesting to have because they add value other than just sitting down and asking about the questions. But the reality is that you don't always have to know everything. And I think that so many people get in their minds that they have to know everything because they're the expert. And there's value in the vulnerability of saying, hey, actually, I don't know about that. And sometimes I'm even doing that in real time. And I'm doing that in real time because I used to, when I produced podcasts that were live streamed to YouTube and Facebook, I would talk to the host, switching cameras as we were doing the show, while also researching something in real time and telling the host about it. And so I think that is such a fun thing to do. Especially for those who worked in radio, when you have a producer and the producer is checking things in real time, it makes it so fun for the person listening in because they are making that journey with you in real time. So sometimes when I'm guesting on podcasts and someone asks me something specific, and I did that recently on an interview with my friend Simona Cosentini, I was like, oh, wait, I actually don't know the specific term that we are using in this interview. So I Googled it in real time. And both of us were like, oh, we use this term, but like, how does the acronym really go? And it was so fun to do it in real time with her. And it doesn't look like I know everything. Like, again, nobody knows everything. And to be honest, I would be questioning if someone says, I know everything about everything. With technology evolving so fast, of course, you don't want to look like you don't know what you're talking about. But it's something that I feel most podcasters should lean into because if you don't remember something, you can always say things like, I'm not sure of the term, but actually check in the show notes because I will include that in the show notes, right? So especially if you're doing the show live, like this happens so frequently. And if you're doing the podcast as a pre-recorded episode, sometimes it's a little bit of a weird time to cut. So you just say, hey, I actually don't remember, and I'll list that in the show notes. I do that all the time on this show. So something to consider. Then moving into the perspective of the learner, this is a great opportunity when you're looking at the angle of your hosting style. If you're transitioning into a new industry, or if you are doing something that is almost like a passion project. And when you're doing this, you're almost telling your audience, like, my credentials here don't really matter. I am learning this and I'm taking you with me on this journey. And so that removes the pressure of you having to be the host that knows it all. And it's so funny. This happens all the time. If you're saying something like, this podcast approaches, this topic through a beginner's mind or a learner's mind, like it removes the pressure. And I remember when I was hosting the afternoon show, I would have to learn about a topic for that day, research it, and then talk about it on the radio station. And again, like nobody ever said, like, how dare you not know everything about this one topic that you just had 2 hours to research, right? It doesn't matter. If you're taking the perspective of like, hey, I thought this was super interesting. Check this out, what I've learned this week, right? Like, it's so exciting because we're both learning at the same time. And then in terms of editing versus relaxed, I know that there's a lot of people who think that they have to always be serious. They cannot make a mistake. It really depends on the type of show that you're actually trying to build, but also just, again, I feel that too many people think that they have to be very, very serious to tackle a serious topic. If you're trying to approach that topic from the, hey, podcasting one-on-one, I don't have to be corporate Anna communication in 2017, which was how people talked about subjects. There were no harsh cuts like I do on this podcast. All the cuts were really perfected and nothing would be just noticeable because people would look like they were not professionals if they're doing this, right? So I don't have to bring my radio voice. I don't need to make really crazy, serious, 1,000 take, rehearse the whole podcast because that's just not who I am. So I'm making myself a favor by leaning into how I am normally. So if you are someone who is already very structured, you feel like going through the list of questions and you like creating a podcast that is heavily edited, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're choosing to go down a more off-the-cuff route, there's potential for that too. So just know what you like best and really trust the process that you're worthy of experimenting. Nothing wrong can happen. But setting up that expectation, if you're transitioning from a podcast that is heavily edited into having more off the cuff moments, just know that you have to preface that for the listener so they know. Because, and I hear this all the time, a lot of people say, hey, I don't want people to think that I'm just like slacking on the editing or the editing isn't as tight. Well, again, that actually happened. I remember listening to these podcasts, and again, context. So the podcast that I was listening to, the host was a millionaire, and suddenly their podcast started getting really bad. Like the audio quality was really bad. The editing was really bad. There were moments that were, I recognized, like as a listener and as an expert, I was like, this was not supposed to be in. And because there was never a time where the host said, hey, maybe, again, it happens. Like maybe she had someone who was a very tight editor, an awesome editor, and she, from one day to the other, lost that editing person and she had to pivot. Maybe she had to give that editing to someone else in her team. But again, if it's a millionaire, I expect that podcast to be really good quality, or have that person tell me, hey, we're changing a few things here. Life happens. And so that happened, I think, like that for a month. The episodes were just not good quality. The audio quality was all over the place. And personally, I was just in a time I was just transitioning out of the content that person was creating. But for someone who is a regular person, you don't have those crazy expectations, right? If you're being truthful to your audience and if you're trying something new, it's actually something that you can go on social media and say, hey, I'm experimenting with something. I would love your input. What do you think about this latest episode? You may be really surprised with the outcome, but also giving yourself grace, especially in the beginning, and understanding that if you want a really tight interview, you will have to just either practice a lot or just be patient with time, right? Like I remember listening to my first podcast episodes and I was like, oh wow, like I was just getting into the habit of like really looking at the camera, thinking about what I wanted to say, making sure that I was covering the things that I wanted to talk about, talking longer, because before I was just talking like in short bits for social media. So there's just so much that will happen. You have to give yourself grace. And that's something that is exciting to listen back and say, hey, those first podcast episodes, I was trying to figure out everything. And now I'm such a more confident host. And it's so much fun to figure out like what type of host you want to be. And then the type of podcast you want. Do you want a clean hosting style? And by clean, I mean, not swearing and all of that. By the way, if you're uploading the content and if you're swearing, you do have to tell your hosting platform that you are swearing on that podcast, because as podcasts are being served to communities people, children and smart speakers and all of that, there's no way to serve that kind of content without like quote unquote like a heads up. Having an explicit mark on that episode is super important to also make sure that you're not getting in trouble. The last thing that I want to remind you of is that you can do two things. You can do a podcast that is, to the point. You're doing a show that is just, like question, answer. But if you're having a conversation, you probably want to move into a more conversational style, just more like in flow. And if that means to throw the questions out the window because you went down a rabbit hole that was really interesting, you should feel like confident to do that too. Or what I've done, sometimes I've spent a lot of time talking through things that like the conversation took us into really interesting points. And so what we ended up doing was record a part 2. And that was episode 41 and 42, I believe, with Sarah. We're talking about SEO. And it was breaking down like SEO for podcasters. It was super interesting. And I think it was just one of those things that it just makes you feel like you're listening to a very organic conversation. And for those who want to move into that type of podcast that feels like the listener is almost like a fly in the wall, a lot of those podcasts are either heavily edited to make it seem like it flows naturally, or the host has had a lot of training through the years. Maybe they invested in a coach, or maybe they have a team of people who prepare their interviews and make sure that they're on cue, right? So if that's something that you want to move into, just know that those two scenarios is what you should expect. So I hope that this was a useful podcast and I removed a lot of limiting beliefs, because I feel like people are holding off sharing so many good ideas because they feel that they're not quote unquote an expert. And if you're not an expert, have an expert and you take the lead as the learner with the listener. So honing in that decision before you relaunch a podcast or before you launch a new season, it's super important to make sure that you're set for success and deepen the trust with your audience. I've been Anna Xavier, and everything that I mentioned in this podcast episode will be at thepodcastspace.com. If you want to work with me to improve all the things that I talked about, you can find the information on how to work with me as well. So just keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.